specifically comments about like competitive culture and how it's negatively affecting online games, specifically about like player skill. And it would be interesting to see how these things are going to be analyzed from this perspective, because a lot of people have strong opinions about like things like skill-based matchmaking and online growth, content itself. There's a lot of like fascinating topics that this video is going to be covering. So I figure we see how it goes, see his point of view about it, and have a discussion about it because it might be fun. So let's go ahead and check it out. This pertains to a lot of like online games, not just like FPSs, as we'll see here.
Particularly player versus player games are a very difficult thing to get into. No other type of entertainment media has the minimum skill requirement that can be found, particularly in modern titles. For decades, gamers have been enjoying and mastering a huge variety of games. And as the medium ages and the technology that drives these experiences improves, what gamers are capable of continues to expand. Gaming has been a staple for so long now that some have played their entire lives. Some have even built multi-million-dollar careers.
Yeah.
Professionals who play games competitively at live events in front of millions of spectators and fans, all by refining their craft over tens of thousands of hours. The rise of the competitive gamer has been nothing short of meteoric, but it does make you wonder, what happens when everyone you play against is super competitive?
Question.
Competitive culture in gaming is rife and touches every game, whether it fits or not. Sweats, tryhards, cheaters. Familiar accusations to those who inhabit the online gaming space. You can't go 20 minutes in an online forum without someone complaining about someone else. And while extremely common, it's not always unfounded. Play any online game long enough and you're bound to run into someone who takes it extremely seriously, who treats it like a day job, despite the clear absence of pay or even recognition. Someone who has optimized the game down to the finest details through thousands of hours of trial and error. Is this a bad thing? Like, sure.
So as like a fighting game consumer, like someone that consumes fighting games constantly, this is something that I've seen so much of. Obviously, like FPSs have this exact same issue, but as a fighting game player, the game is literally designed in a way for you to try to figure it out as a science. And that culture is really pervasive in fighting games in particular. It's a not very like new player friendly experience or casual player experience friendly. Now, granted, there's been a recent shift in that over recent games, where there's been more protections that are put up to try to keep experienced players away from newer players, especially like in games like Street Fighter 6. They've definitely gone out of their ways to try to like segment experienced players away from newer players. And some people do find that to be frustrating, while I think that vast majority of people are going to find that to be a positive thing, because it's not, you know, it can create a toxic environment in a lot of ways. And a lot of people say like, just, level up, bitch. But it's definitely an interesting phenomenon to watch, and it's not exclusive to the games that I play, for example, like fighting games. It's also something that we see in FPSs, racing games, variety of games for that matter. Anything that's competitive at all. Even games that are not competitive, like, for example, like, what's that game that was, Fall Guys. When people start figuring out, like, how to win and be the winner in that game, people start figuring out, like, the science of how to get better in each one of those trials. I know I definitely did, because I wanted to win. It's fun. But yeah. At times, when you pursue that process of having fun, it can ruin the process at the same time. Pursue the process of getting better can ruin the fun.
Sure, you can do whatever you like with your free time, but does this have any sort of notable impact outside of annoying the occasional Redditor? Could competitive culture, for example, kill off a game's player base? In today's video, we're going to dissect the way player skill influences online games, look at some examples of games that might have been affected, and potential ways that these things can be mitigated. Let's cover some important terminology first.
And I personally think that it's important to have this discussion because since I am a fighting game consumer, it is important to have a healthy player base in fighting games. I've played many fighting games where the player base dwindles so fast, or with like after 6 months, the player base is basically just down to like the last 30 or 40, 50 people. So the only way to play the fighting game is like through Discord at that point. You have to reach out to people and go take an effort to go out to those people, which I think is a negative problem. It's great to have people to play with, sure. At least there's a method to do so, but it shouldn't be like you have to jump through hoops to, you know, to go through something like that. You know, everyone having to line up their work schedule to make it work in that specific time frame. It gets exhausting. And it's one of those things where maintaining a healthy player of casual as well as, you know, competitive players, an appropriate rotation of that is really important.
The skill ceiling is the measure of the potential peak performance in a game. It's not generally quantifiable, but it becomes fairly apparent through a deep understanding of a game's mechanics. The skill ceiling depends by and large on what the game lets you do, willingly or not. This limit may rise or fall depending on updates or discoveries made by players. It's something that is actively coveted by the more competitively focused, for fun or profit.
And I love the fact that he depicted skill ceiling as something that is allowed by the game or allowed by the player specifically, because sometimes players discover things that the developers didn't intend, and there are multiple cases of that have happened not just through fighting games but even FPSs, like, you know, glitches and exploits or certain like tactics that the developers didn't intend for it to be that strong. These are things that end up happening, and then once people discover them, they become metas. You know, it's a common thing.
In that vein, you have your own theoretical skill ceiling that might be different to the game's. A maximum ability level dictated by many variables,
Damn, nice shot.
like age, natural ability, or available playtime. Conversely, the skill floor is the minimum performance required to play something. It's rarely the focus of conversation, outside of games that have different methods of play, like unique builds or characters. The skill floor is at its lowest when it comes to single-player experiences, as these are often designed to be extremely approachable, customizable experiences.
Depending on the game, of course. Some games are designed to have a high skill ceiling.
The use of virtual opponents or
yes,
AI
traditionally that is the case.
A game as hard or as easy as the developers allow them. When it comes to multiplayer games, however, it's rarely that simple. The difficulty is not just dictated by the developers, but by other players as well. For example, to play at a certain rank in a competitive game, it might demand a much higher skill floor for it to be enjoyable. A game might have a lot of mechanical depth or meta builds that put you at a disadvantage if you don't keep up with them. You might start a game late in its life cycle and find yourself behind in its progression. These things can change how accessible a game is to a general audience, particularly the casual crowd. Much like you have your own skill ceiling, you likely have your own skill floor too, which is essentially your tolerance for how bad you can be at a certain game before you quit.
And I think that the quantifiability of like something being a skill, like a personal skill floor, isn't just something that you're having fun, like how bad you are that can ruin your fun. It's about whether or not you're actually having fun. That's the bigger component.
Experienced gamers might have higher standards for themselves, but they might still be performing above average compared to most people, but it's not enough for them specifically. The skill floor is why game balancing, the act of modifying a game to keep the experience fair, is a significant part of post-launch work. It's so important that even the level of game balancing must be balanced. Don't balance enough and people will feel cheated or forced to play against people who have unfair advantages. Balance too much and nothing sticks out, and everything becomes stale and samey. This is all to say that multiplayer games are an ecosystem, one that is maintained both by developers and players, with people entering and leaving constantly. These ecosystems also mean that active player count is something that is tracked for many different titles, and you can directly see how well a game is performing in the public eye. The launch of a multiplayer game tends to be the point in which it has the most players. Not
yes,
always.
And there'll always be a significant drop-off after like 3 to 6 months. Every game will always go through that, no matter which one it is.
Are at their lowest. People are still getting adjusted to the game, and the full spectrum of experience level can be encountered. This is usually when you'll run into the largest number of casual players. After some time, the player count usually starts to decline. This isn't really an indication of a game's success or failure. Games built off a lot of hype will invariably have that hype fade. And even really well-managed games will struggle to maintain their initial player base. At this point, both the skill ceiling and skill floor start to creep up. The logic behind this is that you're much more likely to stick with a game you understand well over one you don't. Therefore, those players who struggle to play the game are more likely to quit. And the players at the bottom of the skill ladder become less frequent opponents, either because they leave to play something else or because they just get better.
Yes.
This rise in average skill is extremely apparent for games that don't see a steady influx of new players. As a game continues to age, this cycle continues. Experienced players get better and better, and the player base slowly bleeds active players until they die, whether that be in 10 days or 10 years. This is a typical multiplayer game life cycle. It's not an exact science. A lot of games' post-launch success depends on what the developers and marketers do with it. Some games can even eventually eclipse their initial player counts, but over a long enough period of time, this will be the fate of every game. YouTube videos behave much the same. They get most of their views early on, but after a while only the more dedicated fans come back to rewatch them. I mentioned that players will leave games that they are bad at. I'm sure if you've played a large enough variety of games, you've invariably come across one you didn't click with at all, got destroyed in a couple attempts and uninstalled, in some way failing to reach your required skill floor. But I also mentioned that skill floor is dictated.
Hold up there. Was he playing on Was he playing on? Oh yeah, he was playing on simplified controls. I was about to say, if he was able to pull off an electric, damn, we got a sudden top. We got ourselves a sudden like top tier player hiding out in the ecosystem, hiding out in plain sight. But now he's rocking the simple controls.
Some way failing to reach your required skill floor. But
that's a bad thing. It's just funny.
Is dictated in part by the people playing the game. So the question is, does the skill floor play a significant factor in player retention?
Okay, so this is a great question to ask. I'm gonna wait. Okay, yeah, so that way I can light up my camera room a little bit better with more lighting. From my perspective, it does. It does. I believe that without having a way to the question that is that
in people playing the game. So the question is, does the skill floor play a significant factor in player retention?
So again, this isn't skill ceiling, this is skill floor. This is the bare minimum that is required to keep people engaged. This is what is important to keep people wanting to play more. And this is the problem with having a game that has a skill floor that is too high, where the entry is really difficult. And fighting games typically have a very high skill floor from a lot of perspective, even though I don't think that's genuinely the case. I think that a lot of people have a negative perception of it, but that perception is reality, so people are going to believe that. But that has a meaningful impact. It will stick. That idea will stick, and because of that, player retention will drop off fast. Even if there's a lot of players at the beginning, players will drop off really fast. And we saw this incredibly evident with Dragon Ball FighterZ. Even I never played the game, but I saw that the player count for that game dropped really quick. After 90% of the player base dropped off after a month, something like that. It was crazy fast. But that is typical. But at the same time, the skill floor was not high or was not low enough for those players, because they weren't having fun with the game, because they were getting dogpiled by experienced fighting game players. And again, for a lot of experienced players that are fighting game players, they're tough, get good. But then you got people that are not going to participate in the ecosystem of playing the game anymore. But yes, of course it does. This is a great example that he used. I recently bought this game, BattleBit, I recently bought BattleBit like a month ago, and I started jumping on and playing the game, which I've been having a lot of fun with. I've been playing it entirely off stream on my own personal time, and while I've been playing this game, I realized, holy shit, the players here are really good. And I'm not entirely surprised because this game's been out for a long time, but I never had access to it because my PC would not run it, at least for me. It would not run it because I didn't take the time to, you know, like, learn how to rock my own PC until like the last year or so. But a lot of players have had access to this game for years, and I remember it was blowing up big. It was all over like social media and shit like that, and people were having a great time with it. And I was like, man, I would love to play a Battlefield style game again. And then I saw that it was on sale, you know, about a month ago. I was like, oh, you know what? I'll give it a shot. I'm pretty sure I'll get my ass kicked, but you know, I'll give it a shot. So I'm like I have a really keen experience with this as a new player that jumped in and, you know, experienced that new player retention. Now, here's the thing. Last several weeks, I've not been playing the game much at all. It's not because the player base is so fucking good and I get smashed, because I do get smashed all the fucking time in that game. A lot of it is just like learning all the mechanics in the game. The game is actually really, really deep, and it has a lot of like in-depth mechanics that I did not expect. I thought it was going to be very Battlefield-esque, but there's a lot more to this game than just a Battlefield clone. There is, like, you know, mechanics of dragging people and healing them and reviving them while you're dragging them. There's like some kind of mechanic where you can scale a wall, like do like a double jump of some kind, and then there's all these like hidden mechanics that I did not expect. And I'm like, oh wow, damn, I got a lot to learn. And that's kind of daunting for a new player, because you have to like catch up with a lot of people, and it's not the fact that you're losing that's overwhelming, it's the time investment to learn all these skills. You know, that. And I was expecting, jumping into this game, well, I've played Battlefield plenty of times, so I know exactly how to fucking play, but I'm like, nope, I have to relearn from the ground up. And not only that, but I played Battlefield when I was a console player, specifically, so I had to learn how to play keyboard and mouse on that shit at the same time, so my learning experience even got even longer in the process. It's not, you know, it's not a poo-poo on the game at all. It's a great game, and I still, you know, enjoy it, but I don't commit a large amount of time to it as a casual player. Like, I probably only put like maybe 30 hours at most at this point. But it's a great example he's using.
BattleBit Remastered is a multiplayer FPS game that left early access last year. It was developed by a very small team and did extremely well after it got some traction on social media. You may have seen clips of it before, or maybe even played it. The gameplay is very akin to early Battlefield, but boasts a low poly look that makes it a lot more approachable, especially for players living the low spec gamer life.
Oh, yeah.
The modes are strictly team based, and you work alongside many other players to win. It peaked at over 86,000 players post-launch, but since dropped to a few thousand just under a year later. By most accounts, a success story. However, some community members suggest that the project was mismanaged, and that the development speed was too slow, which meant that it lost the potential of becoming an FPS staple.
Now, I did see a lot of content creators online state that they felt like updates for the game were kicking off great in the beginning of its launch, and then afterwards, like, things slow down significantly. To me, that was weird that they said that, because the only other time that I can think of a game that made the same mistake was Battlefield 1. The difference is that with Battlefield 1, it took them like a whole year for them to update the game, which did not do the game a lot of service. And I do genuinely think that that actually negatively impacted the game. You could have just added some small updates here and there leading up to a major update, but I think that that makes complete sense. In a game like this, I was a little surprised by it because it is such a small development team, and I thought that the player base would be a lot more patient, and then I did hear that like the player base started dwindling really fast. But I do wonder if that was genuinely the case, because content is one of the best ways to keep people engaged. Like, if you're not going to balance the game, that's fine. You know, people can accept an imbalanced game, as frustrating as it can be. That people will play an unbalanced game as long as there's something to do and something to strive for. The problem with metas is that once people figure out metas, then the game becomes routine, and then everyone ends up experiencing the same thing over and over and over again, and that makes the game boring. So you can kind of disrupt that by throwing in new content that makes people like be like, oh, this changes the game completely. You know, it's typically what ends up happening with fighting games is like a new character gets dropped and now everyone's playing a new character, so everyone's experiencing that new experience all over again, or fighting against a new character, so they have to learn how to fight against it. And that makes things interesting. A new map at a new shooting game, you know, that changes the experience because you have to learn the new map and it becomes a fresh new experience. That's one of the easiest ways to like bypass that issue. So having like a steady flow of post content is a great way to delay issues with balance. You should always address balance issues, because if you don't, eventually players that will do permanent damage for a long time. But you can mitigate that by adding content afterwards.
Now, I would describe myself as pretty good. I would say at least better than most. I do have a KD of over 2, which I'm very proud of. However, I'm acutely aware of how high the mechanical ceiling goes. And it has all the hallmarks of a first-person shooter with a crazy high skill ceiling. Mid-air strafing, snap aiming, sprint reloading, meta builds, just to name a few. And the game.
And I remember when I first jumped on this, I was surprised how many killers there were. I'm like, I wasn't entirely surprised, but like I got the first match I got into, and granted, I was a complete newbie at the game. I probably got fucking like 3 kills, and I died like 50 times. And I was fine with it. It was okay because I was still learning the game, so it's tolerable. But yeah, it can be discouraging to a certain degree of players. I've got a huge tolerance. I know that about myself.
Certainly does not discourage players from playing in a very sweaty way. Despite all of this, early BattleBit was actually a very casual environment. Most people weren't very good, and most of the clips generated from the game were from people messing around with the proximity chat. However, as the average player got better and better, and understood more of the mechanics and the maps, it became progressively harder to play the game casually. Voice chat got quieter, and the focus shifted towards keeping up with other players. The game quietly lost what had made it popular to begin with. In my opinion, the game's primary shortfall is that it failed to nurture what should have been its main strength: teamwork, and instead bolted an extremely self-sufficient, mechanic-focused playstyle.
Oh, I see. Basically what he's saying is that the game enables players to be one-man armies, which is a problem in a team-based video game. Because if you got one person who can carry an entire team and do devastating amount of work on their own, as opposed to working with other players, this can be a disruptor for people that are playing casually. And it can be fun for one player, but that one player can do a lot of damage for everyone else. And that's a tough position to be in. You know, it's like, I'm not talking about like smurfing or anything. That's a totally different conversation. It's just that the game enables and rewards players for being a one-man army and gives them a shit ton of points. And yes, they are contributing to the team, of course, but it doesn't encourage the player to actually like help, or, you know, I suppose the better way to describe it is it doesn't encourage the player to be a teammate, as opposed to just being a fucking slaughterhouse. You know, he just slaughters players constantly. While like in games like Battlefield, for example, Battlefield 3 is, you know, a great example of it. They introduced a lot of like assist mechanics where you don't actually have to actually get the kill. Like there's a lot of other mechanics that you can be rewarded for that will get you a contribution to the team without ever having to, you know, spill blood on your hands. Like medics obviously is a common one that people talk about. Spotting in those games in Battlefield can net you great rewards, especially if you're a scout who's using binoculars. You can gain a lot of assists, and that can stack up points incredibly well. Appropriate spawn locations that allow your team to make critical table turning events, because they're able to spawn at a very critical spot that allows them to gain like an appropriate flank in the right way, and allows them to steal momentum. Suppression, even for people that are aggressive players that want to shoot big weapons like heavy machine guns, light machine guns, you can attach a bipod and just drop rounds and suppress the hell out of the enemy, and you'll get points for that when a player is killed by that. That's a great way of doing that. You know, there are more. I'm sure that BattleBit has plenty of team-based points that reward you, like revivals and healings and stuff like that. Because I've played through the game and I've noticed I get rewarded for doing those things. But I definitely noticed that the game rewards you heavily, way more for being a killer than it is for being an actual like teammate. It's not to say that both can't exist, but the game is far more rewarding to killers.
It doesn't take much playtime to realize that you interact with your team very little.
And that's what I meant right there, specifically interaction with your team. It's not just about like killing the other players. It's about like using other tactics that you can participate in that doesn't pertain to just being a killer. There should be a cohesive environment that other people can do. In fighting games, that doesn't exist. That does not exist. You win or you lose. You kill the other player or you lose, and that is it. And that can make it very like that might be the contributing factor about why people feel that it's a very not invitive and very difficult barrier of entry for a lot of people.
It didn't help either that the devs seemingly kept buffing things that made working solo more convenient, like the healing bandages that over time have not only increased in number.
I don't know any of this stuff because I wasn't present for these changes.
At this point, you must force yourself to team play, otherwise you're just running from objective to objective.
Man,
you
what?
must force yourself to team play, otherwise you're just running from objective to objective, shooting people on the way, which not only gets old very quickly, but when mechanical skill is the primary focus, not playing well matters a lot more, since there's no other aspect of the game to fall back on.
That's what I'm talking about specifically in like shooting games like this, is that like if you can't dole out the punishment and be a killer in the game and get a high KD, then you're not contributing to the team. You are actually a liability at that point. So being a high level content or a high level killer in these games is really the only expression for a lot of that, and that can be a problem, especially for a Battlefield game. For a Battlefield game, there should be multiple ways to express yourself and ways to contribute to the cause.
Like interacting with your team. I think even the devs noticed this too, as they added a squad preference screen where you can choose how serious you want your squad to be. And
yeah, but I don't understand. Like, I tried using that, and I don't understand how it works entirely. Like, it seems simple, but no one does it. No one follows it.
Mechanics that drives non-mechanical, casual players away, whether intentional or not, is the crux of the problem. And BattleBit is far from the only game that suffers from it. I describe it as the mechanical arms race, and it's a really tough thing to quantify, but it's noticeable on both an individual game scale and across the games industry as a whole. In some way, either as a symptom or a cause, games get too competitive for their own good, and bleed their casual audience because of it. It's a problem not just for competitive games, but casual ones too. It's often such an issue that you can always tell how competitive a game is going to be in the future, just by playing it for a few hours. Answer this question for me. Have you ever played a new release, either alone or with friends, and had that thought creep into your mind that you're not going to be playing this game in a month, despite how fun it might be in the moment?
Yeah, I've had that one.
Playing a game, and you suddenly become aware of how the game operates, and you can foresee what the rest of your playtime would look like. So what if I do that, you might be wondering? What does it matter if I play a game for 100 hours and then burn out after a couple months? I still got my money's worth. For you, not really a problem. But it runs counter to what most multiplayer games companies are aiming for.
Yeah, they want you to just keep playing. That's, for us as a consumer, that's great. For the not the developers, but the publishers, the ones that are making money off of our sales, that's not good for them. Not because of them not making an immediate profit, it's that they want more profit. That's why. So they want you to keep playing the game so they can keep selling you microtransactions, DLCs, and many other things. And it's also good for their business model too. It's good for their game. You know, they want to see people continue playing their game because that's the goal. The longer people continue playing their game, the better.
It's having serious implications for the gaming industry. Games as a service isn't all too new of a concept.
Oh, I hate this.
But surged
I hate games as a service thing.
As of late. The concept is simple. Games are supported post-launch with new content, and in turn you continue to play the same game.
And here's the thing, I have such mixed feelings about games as a service because I clearly participated in it as a fighting game consumer, because fighting games have now effectively become purely games as a service. They add new post-launch content stuff, and it's great to see new characters and see an extended support of it. Fighting games are a perfect example of games as a service. So I do dabble in it, and I'm sure that there are plenty other people that dabble in other games, like MMOs, for example, are a perfect example of games as a service that succeed. But what's frustrating about it is that games as a service is just so fucking predatory currently as it stands. It can be so overpriced, or if it's not overpriced, it's like they're just clearly like trying to manipulate you to purchase shit in a way that's really, and of course, you know, a lot of people say, of course, that's what they're supposed to do, but it just feels slimy, and it makes you feel frustrated by the fact that like this game that you enjoy is taking that direction. You know, like it's a really complicated feeling, and at the same time there's definitely a two sides thing to it. There's a bad side to it because you can get sold a half-baked product that is not complete, and then you get a finished product like a year down the road finally, or you can get a really good product in the beginning and it gets ruined by the end, or maybe you get like a decent product that gets really good by the end of its life cycle. However, you're getting gouged out of it, you know, you're getting whaled out of your money constantly. It's such a complicated thing. It's definitely one of the elements when I was growing up as a kid that I thought that games as a service is like a no-brainer and an awesome idea. But as I've gotten older, it's definitely exhausting because it's more time-consuming in a lot of ways.
And continue to support that game through various means. This is why it's common for someone to have a main game.
Yeah, I have that.
Others,
yeah.
As introducing new content.
But my main game switches a lot.
Fresh, and means that fans get more of what they know they'll like. This tends to work in favor of games companies too, as they get more money from the average player with much less development time. A 2023 study that surveyed over 500 games companies reported that 95% of them were aiming to release a live service game in the future.
Holy shit!
The only limit to this system is that these games live and die by their ability to retain players, which involves not only keeping people interested year-round,
that shit ain't going away.
Competing against other similar live service games.
And here's the thing, I don't mind the games service model. I'm fine with it. As long as there's single-player games, there are other games that we can chew our content out of. What I don't like is single-player games that become live service games. I don't mind multiplayer games becoming live service because that's fine. You're already dumping a lot of hours in, and there's content that can like switch things up a little bit. But single player content games, I really have an issue with them being games live service. I think that is where we need to draw the model at. But unfortunately, that is one of the best ways to like get support for those games, and you really need support for those games. Otherwise, investors are not going to be interested in like, you know, saying, publishers are going to be like, there's not enough money to be incentivized into selling single player games. And even though that's not true, it's not the amount of money that they want, because they're being incredibly egregious with their projects, as opposed to just steadily increasing it over a period of time. You know, Capcom's got the right idea about how they're approaching their games as a service, as well as like their single player games. You know, I think that they've got it figured out finally. But you know, there are plenty other games out there, or plenty other game publishers out there that don't have the right idea. Ubisoft is a clear example of this, where they approach games as a service with their single player models just as much as they approach it with their multiplayer models, because they include all these absurd microtransaction-y currency systems where you have to pay for currency to get an upgrade in the game that you're playing for a single player game. It makes sense to have a currency system in a multiplayer game. People will accept that, but in a single player game, it just doesn't make any fucking sense.
Games for their attention too. If Apex Legends, for example, flopped on release, that likely would have killed the Titanfall IP right then and there.
Yeah, that would have.
Alongside Respawn Entertainment. While the gaming industry is huge, there's only so many players to go around. So maybe sort of ironically, competition is fierce. So what does this have to do with game mechanics? Well, you have to enjoy something about a game to continue playing it. There's only oh so many marketing tactics a game can pull, and if you find a game too stressful or uninteresting, most people can't be manipulated forever. Even addicts will eventually drop games that stop treating them well. But casual players can drop a game over the smallest of things.
This is what I was talking about with like fighting games in particular. You know, that's a lot of where that stress comes from, because like as a casual player, you will, if you get inconvenienced in any capacity, you will get annoyed, and then that floor for you will definitely raise a bit.
Which means that how a game handles its experience determines a lot about how it performs publicly. And since so many games are vying for your attention, the options to go elsewhere are usually extensive, which means that it's easier and easier for games to bleed casual players if they're not careful. New games must also compete with established ecosystems that have now been around for an incredibly long time. Counter-Strike, for example, has been around for over 20 years at this point, and as much as I'm sure veteran players love to poke fun at the game, how the game feels to play has been carefully refined for decades. Even now, Counter-Strike continues to break player records year over year. It's kind of like picking between a friend you've known your entire life and a new person who may or may not be a better friend in the long run. You might try hanging out with this new person, but you know exactly who you're going back to should things turn bad. All of this means that producing a live service multiplayer game in such a saturated market is a serious gamble. Now, having a game flop because it fails to retain a casual audience is a very real issue faced by many in the space.
Yeah. That casual player base is important because
about skill in games,
it doesn't just help
to talk about the elephant.
It doesn't just also help like competitive players be interested in the game, because then they can keep playing casual players and have rotation of people to play through that keeps them constantly engaged. But it's also important that those casual players eventually become experienced players, or casual players fight other casual players and they continue playing the game and they keep purchasing other products within the game and stuff like that to keep the game supported. All those components.
In the room, which is skill-based matchmaking.
Oh yeah, I was wondering when he was going to get to this subject. Oh yeah.
The idea is that a game measures your performance, usually through some sort of rating system, and then curates matches so you play with and against players of similar skill to you. The main benefit is that it provides tangible progression for players in ways that some games would lack otherwise. It also helps prevent less experienced players from getting stomped, and it allows games with smaller lobby sizes, like 2015's Rocket League or 2023's The Finals, to maintain a sense of fair play that wouldn't exist if things were random. Chances are, if you're watching this video on game mechanics, you likely have seen some strong opinions on skill-based matchmaking.
Prior to me watching this, I watched multiple videos about skill-based matchmaking because of, I think what was the game? It was Call of Duty skill-based matchmaking kind of news that came out, that they ended up like turning off skill-based matchmaking for half the player base to see what they would do if they actually wanted that. And it turned out that most players didn't like that, and there was a huge drop-off of player retention that ended up occurring. And there was a lot of players that are very anti-skill-based matchmaking that are very upset about this, because they're like, you know, either accusing Activision of lying, or they're saying that their data is wrong and they're interpreting it wrong to push some kind of agenda. Which I think that they're wrong. I think that the development team, as well as the publishers and all these analysts that are in the company, they understand that people are going to want to continue playing their game for an extended period of time, and they want to keep them engaged for as long as possible. They don't have an incentive to keep skill-based matchmaking in there if it's going to hurt them ultimately in the end. I think that it just hurts that player that has a problem with it, because now they have to work really hard to enjoy the game, which does suck for them, but the vast majority of other players are going to be fine. But it does suck because you know, we as human beings, we feel that our world revolves around us.
You might even have some of your own. A common perception is that these systems, even when well managed, frustrate players and sometimes don't prevent the things they were designed for.
And they even frustrate me, even though I think that skill-based matchmaking is overall a net positive. I don't think it's a great thing. I think there's better systems that can be put in place. A better skill-based matchmaking possibly that could be put in place. I have my own gripes about the idea of it. I I've been a victim of it. I've been a victim of like saying like, okay, now the game's gotten too hard now because every person I play against is so fucking good that it's hard for me to enjoy the game anymore now. And I've been in that position before. Plenty of players have that are good at video games.
Like unfair matches. A long-term concern with skill-based matchmaking is that, almost against your will, you're fast-tracked into a competitive arms race just to enjoy yourself. Since everyone you play with has, and usually expects, a certain minimum level of ability, there's no opportunity for you to relax and maybe take things a little slower. Your reward for playing well is harder games, and your reward for playing casually is, well, losing. So in some ways, you're left with no choice but to endlessly improve, even if focused gameplay isn't what you're looking for. On a larger scale, these systems also promote competitiveness and raise the mechanical skill of your average gamer, which in some ways is a good thing. The recent competitive push has allowed mainstream games to become more mechanically complicated and include greater depth, as your average gamer is a lot more competent at understanding new games than they were in the past. However, this does mean that multiplayer games in particular are harder to approach at a casual level. It's almost a requirement for any player versus player game to feature some sort of rank progression, as a lot of gamers have come to expect that whenever they're faced with human opponents. The near absolute saturation of competitive modes means that, oftentimes, non-competitive modes might as well be competitive anyway.
Kind of an interesting statement. I actually think that's a very interesting statement here.
The near absolute saturation of competitive modes means that, oftentimes, non-competitive modes might as well be competitive anyway.
And that kind of like stems from that same thing that I mentioned before about like a game that is not competitive at all, like Fall Guys, has an issue with competitive play experience, despite the game not legitimately being a competitive game at all. Yeah, there's going to be one winner, but there's going to be one winner out of like 200 players, and it's can be completely random sometimes. You know, you'll do the best that you can to stay alive, but this shit happens, you know? Sometimes you get the bad end of the straw, or you just didn't get it right, you know? You know, it's times like that. Even if you make a game mode where it's the same game where you have a ranked playlist, and you have a playlist where it's literally just shits and giggles and experimental fun shit that just gets people having fun, they'll still play that experimental game mode as competitively as possible because they want to win. The idea of winning is so intoxicating or is so alluring because that's the objective of that game mode, in which, you know, obviously you have certain other things that you could be doing. Ultimately, I always feel that it's in your best interest to have a wide range of game modes that are diverse and unique in every capacity. I don't think that it's just 4v4, 1v1, team-based 2v2, you know, or free-for-all. I don't think it's just as simple as that. I think that you need something like horde mode. You know, you need a horde mode game mode for one component. You need a objective-based, team-based story mode where you have to get through certain segments, kind of like how Uncharted 2 did that, where you have like a co-op mode that's its own like self-contained story mode, you know, things like that. Granted, those things also live their own short lifespan, but these things help make the life experience really long and enjoyable. Like for me, at a personal point, I have one really strong opinion about one game that had a very profound impact on me, and I didn't play it that much, which was Resistance 2 for the PlayStation 3. That game had some of the coolest fucking online infrastructure, or not infrastructure, but like online modes that I've ever seen. You can have 16-player co-op against a giant horde that you have to complete certain missions with, but the game still has 8v8 competitive game modes that are like team-based, capture the flag, a variety of different like competitive modes, but they have this awesome team-based, massive team-based AI game mode where you have to work cohesively together as a team, and it would change the map, and it would change the AI and the amount of enemies that you would face based on how large the players in the team are. So if you like don't have a full 12-person roster or full 16-player roster, you only have like 5 or 6 players, it'll reduce the difficulty to match that need. And that was so awesome because like you could play, like I remember playing near the like 7 years after the game released, at the end of the PlayStation 3's lifespan, and I thought like, holy shit, there's like not that many players, but I still don't give a fuck. I'm still having fun. I've churned out like at least 30 hours with my brother thinking, damn, this is a lot of fun. I wanted to play more, but I didn't have the game, so I would have churned out hundreds of hours just because that game mode was so cleverly implemented. And I think that's the real way to come up with a solution like that. A diverse game mode that creates a lot of longevity that way. That's creative and fun. Fun being the most important component. That's the problem with competitive game modes. Even if the competitive game mode itself is creative and fun, it's still competitive, you know? So you need something that's a little different.
The Finals is a free-to-play, team-based, first-person shooter released at the end of 2023.
Before we get to this topic, I actually wanted to point out that I remember when Rainbow Six first released, I played the hell out of the game for the first year, but the meta got figured out after that year was over, and eventually they announced like Season 2 and Season 3, Season 4, you know, all these other announcements, Year 2, Year 3, and the game blew up to be massive. But I remember that the game got huge when they released that like Left 4 Dead style game mode, the Zombie Horde mode, that PvE game mode, that eventually they even made their own spin-off game that did not do very well. But I remember when that update released, the game blew up to huge proportions because it had a competitive game mode and then a casual game mode where people can play together and have fun. That is important, to have that balance between the two.
I've spoken about this game before on this channel, but to give context here, it mixes a lot of different shooter styles to make quite an interesting blend of both familiar and experimental mechanics. The game has a very typical player count story, a really strong start with over 200,000 players, and a slow decline as the months rolled on.
I remember a little bit of this game being like showcased at some like some Game Awards stuff.
At around like 15,000.
Okay,
a
typical,
94%
yeah.
drop in the initial player base over 6 months, which might sound bad, but for Embark Studios' first foray into gaming,
oh wow, really?
Daily players,
that's good. That's really good.
Give anything for.
Meaning that if you have in the like anywhere above like 6,000 to 7,000 players, you have a wide breadth of players that have a wide range of skill gaps. And at the very least, anytime that you play the game and queue up, you'll find somebody to play against. That is like an ideal position to be in. You know, if the game's been out for like 4 or 5 years, and you have a player base between like 9,000 to 13,000. That is an ideal position to be in.
I really enjoyed playing the Finals. It has a lot of fun with different mechanics, like
oh shit, it's got just environmental destruction.
It gives it a nice edge over more streamlined FPS games. It also encourages team play in a really healthy way. As each
I do remember seeing the advertisements of this game, and it did catch my interest, but I never gave it a shot. Maybe I should try this one.
The problem for me,
got a really cool animation.
That ultimately led me to stop playing the game regularly.
This should be interesting.
Was the matchmaking.
Oh, okay.
My first impression of the game was extremely strong. I was really enjoying playing as each of the 3 classes, and the people I was playing against were admittedly not very good, and I felt a lot of control over whether our team would win or not.
Yeah, I was having fun whooping ass for a while.
And win matches, I found that the matchmaking was putting me against increasingly difficult and overall sweatier opponents.
Yes,
suddenly, the fun strategies I was implementing stopped working against players, and the potential scope of the mechanics began to narrow down. It even got to the point where I felt like I couldn't use certain characters.
Oh, I see what happened. Oh, I see what happened.
Achieve 0 results.
Oh, I see what happened. So basically, as he got better at the game and he ended up getting higher up in the ranks against more competitive players, the meta was getting figured out. And when the meta got figured out, other options that you could do to be experimental and have fun and do crazy shit with ended up being narrowed down to just a few options, because now you're playing the same game. It's the same discussion we had before. Once you discover a meta, the game gets a lot simpler and becomes a lot less complex. And that's where game balance becomes an important element to the game, and updating the game with game balance. I genuinely believe that it's more important to have like every 4 months to have a balance, so that way you don't need a huge balance patch. There should be like every 4 to 5, maybe 6 months, you have a small balance patch that switches up the gameplay a little bit, buffs smaller, weaker things, and then at the end of the year, you should always do a massive balance update that changes the format of the game and significantly nerfs things that are overpowered or significantly buffs things, you know? But that's what ended up happening, is that the meta got figured out, and then your options become much more limited, and so then before long you're experiencing the same game rotation all the time, and that can hurt the play experience.
Then eventually went entirely off the heavy class, as it felt too clunky, and I couldn't contribute positively.
Yeah.
Very quickly, the game became just another sweaty shooter. Despite the fact that I never actually touched any competitive mode, I would find myself getting annoyed at certain classes and common matchups, and I wasn't having nearly as much fun as I was when I started out.
So the matchmaking wasn't what was screwing him. It sounds like to me it was more the balance of the game, honestly, because matchmaking did put him against more sweatier players, but the game didn't have. It sounds like there were certain mechanics in the game that were so strong that other experimental options became less involved in the higher level of play, which is typical.
It's not even that the game is bad, it's a really well-made game with interesting mechanics. However, I was hoping for a more casual experience, and it's not one I could find within the game's matchmaking.
You're never gonna find a casual experience when it's competitive, though. That's the nature of it. That's why people were complaining about party games having competitive elements to them, or competitive players wanting to win so badly. You know, like the social media post of that guy that was playing Fall Guys, and he was jumping on every single one of those little dials that drop underneath you. He's like doing one at a time and staying alive as long as possible. You know, even though that's the objective of the game.
But being disillusioned by a game due to its matchmaking does raise an interesting question. Is it really the system's fault to begin with? You may have heard this phrase
Good
before.
question.
Given the opportunity, players will optimize the fun
Yes,
of the game.
That's exactly
this is a
it.
quote from Soren Johnson, one of the leads on Civilization 3. It suggests that some people view games less as an entertainment medium and more as an optimization puzzle, one that, no matter the game, can be solved through
exactly. There's a science to every game.
The problem with solving, or even attempting to solve, a game is that it effectively becomes complete and no longer interesting.
It's a great way to put it. I love that. That's a great analogy.
And the easier new ones become to solve. I mentioned earlier the concept of figuring out a game's systems, and knowing that eventually you'll stop playing. That's you effectively solving the game in your mind, almost seeing the future of what the game will offer, and deciding that, since you already know what's coming, it's not worth sticking around to see it. The destiny of games is to become boring, not to be fun. Those of us who want games to be fun are fighting a losing battle against the human brain.
I think that's a good point.
Fun is a process, and routine is its destination.
Oh, that's great. That's a great quote. I love that quote. A Theory of Fun for Game Design by Ralph Koster. That's a great quote. That makes complete sense to me.
Destination. While this quote is more about gaming's place among society in general, I think it applies here too. The ultimate problem is that what makes a game interesting is some degree of uncertainty. If you knew how a strategy game was going to play out from start to finish, you wouldn't find it interesting. Like how tic-tac-toe stops being an interesting game to play once you know how to never lose. However, uncertainty is uncomfortable and something most people avoid fanatically in their day-to-day lives. The irony of gaming is that to enjoy it at its best, you must chase uncertainty and avoid optimization. It's why games like Rust and DayZ, relentless survival games, which from an outsider's perspective seem like a nightmare to play and manage, are insanely popular. There's a thrill to their uncertainty, that there's no guarantees from moment to moment.
That's
Even
true.
Logging on doesn't guarantee you the same position that you left with. Competitive gaming, both as
I never thought about it from that
and a
perspective.
subculture, is about removing uncertainty in as many aspects as possible. And while professional gaming is a beloved subgenre of gaming, it directly defies games with more casual intentions, which means that games can lose their casual communities extremely easy if they're not careful. And since casual players tend to outnumber hardcore gamers by a significant margin, live service titles rely heavily on being able to retain them for long periods of time. But what can be done to counteract the mechanical arms race? It's a systemic problem that is reinforced by competitive trends in gaming. And while it seems like a far-reaching problem that's nigh impossible to solve, there are practical things that can be done on many levels to counteract
You played against
it.
a god of
On
destruction?
a personal level, if you feel like the games you play are becoming too stressful, or they're just routinely frustrating, it's okay to switch to casual or more controllable single-player
That's what I do.
experiences. The concept of retiring from competitive games is a frequent phenomenon, especially for older gamers who have much less time to keep up with the race.
Yeah.
Even just partially stepping away can do wonders for your enjoyment of games overall. Another option is to pick one competitive game to main and then avoid all others. For game developers, it's a
I don't think I think that's limited.
time of games is a frequent phenomenon, especially for older gamers who have much less time to keep up with the race. Even just partially stepping away can do wonders for you.
I think that's important. Take a break from the game. I've taken breaks from games for like 6 months. Even if it is a competitive game, is it hard to get back into it because you get your ass kicked, especially if you're at that previous rank? Of course. But you allow yourself the mental state that you are rusty at the game and you have a higher tolerance because of that. However, these game mechanics do need to include some form of degradation process, so that way, like, players that are out of the loop for an extended period of time, they can find themselves back at a more appropriate skill level, you know. And of course, you know, people are worried about that becoming like a smurfing thing, and it can be abused. But here's the thing: Smurfs are always going to be there, so it's not like it matters that much. What matters more is that you have guardrails in place that prevent the player that has taken a break from getting too carried away. So, like, for example, let's say that you work your way through master rank in Street Fighter 6, you know, and now you've stopped playing the game for a whole year. Well, you're not going to be as good at the game as you were when you got to master rank. The game should allow you to drop your rank down to diamond rank at that point and then hold you there. However, you should gain twice as many points every time that you play, so that way you quickly run out of diamond rank as fast as possible without being so disruptive, so it eases you into the game, you know, something like that. Now, I don't think that's the actual right solution. I'm just saying that there should be something similar to that. That could be a solution or something in the same vein as that. So that way, you know, that can happen, because players will stop playing and they'll need a break, and sometimes when they come back, they're reminded why they stopped playing. So sometimes that can be helpful.
Your enjoyment of games overall. Another option is to pick one competitive game to main and then avoid all others.
So I don't do this, and I have no issue with playing other games. I'm fine with playing all these other games over here and still playing my quote-unquote main game. I still play them. You don't have to avoid all others. You can play a bunch of variety of different games. As a matter of fact, every time that you play other kinds of games, even if they're not the same genre, they actually help you get better at your current game, because you gain insight into things that you never had before. So it's encouraged to be someone that plays a wide variety of games and have fun. It also builds your tolerance for the main game that you're playing. It builds your tolerance up for them, because you're not getting burnt out on this game and you're filling yourself in with other games that meet that need, even if they're competitive games, you know. Let's say that, like, Tekken is my main game, which it's not. But let's say that it is. Well, I can still play Street Fighter, I can still play KI, I can still play Mortal Kombat. Why? Because they're different kinds of fighting games, and they meet me at different needs and that I need. Maybe I'm tired of playing this game. Maybe I need to play Mortal Kombat for a little while. Maybe I need to play FPS for a little while. You know, there's reasons to play other kinds of competitive games. Yeah, are you never going to be a professional if you don't commit yourself completely? Yeah, but vast majority of people are not going to be professional players, and those that strive to be, they will need to commit to this. But even competitive players that play this, guess what they do? They do exactly what I do. They play other competitive games that meet their needs because there's so much overlap, but also more importantly, it keeps them from getting burnt out on this game that they play religiously.
For game developers, it's a difficult situation. No matter the type of multiplayer game, it's an open invite for players to try and optimize it. But the best course of action is to make something non-mechanical the primary selling point. It could be story, or a social feature,
yes,
or
I agree.
number of things. If you want to make a competitive game...
What he's saying here is the main focus of the game should be something that is fun and not competitive. There should be a core feature that is, hey, this is the fun part of the game. The competitive part should be the end game content, which is what like a lot of looter shooters try to do, where like, hey, we have this main component of the game that you are forced to play in that is a lot of fun, and then the end game content is the real game that kicks in afterwards. The problem at hand is a lot of looter shooters fuck that part up, and then the end game part is the actual fun part of the game. And so a lot of casual players lose interest really quickly after they finish that core experience. So, you know, it's important to craft a really good main experience. And I would say like a perfect example of this for Street Fighter 6 and Tekken 8, Tekken 8's main component is that story mode, while in Street Fighter it's the World Tour mode. And I think those are both success stories in their own right, because it's good, you know, casual player-based stuff.
It's better to fully commit to a competitive experience, rather than having it be a small part of a wider game. It's important to note at the end here that gaming isn't necessarily fated to continually get more competitive. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that the opposite is happening. All one has to do is see what the most popular games of recent years are.
That's true.
Elden Ring, Baldur's Gate 3, Lethal Company, all games without any competitive underpinnings.
This is true.
It's also fairly evident through browsing company.
Well, here's the thing. I think Elden Ring does have some kind of, it has some PvP elements into the game, so it may not be quote unquote a competitive game. It may have a small competitive ecosystem, but you know, it is inherently a cooperative game because the game entices you to be cooperative with other players.
All games without any competitive underpinnings. It's also fairly evident.
And you know what? I just had a realization that Elden Ring is in a lot of ways, granted, I never played Elden Ring, but I played Dark Souls games. Souls games are in a lot of ways very similar to that of Resistance 2, where it has multiple game modes. It has the single player experience that you can play. It has that team-based experience where you fight against a common enemy, a common AI enemy that is overwhelming, that allows you to rotate in and out with other players, and it has competitive play. It does exactly what Resistance does, and I loved like Dark Souls 1 and 2. Granted, I never got around to playing Dark Souls 3 or Sekiro or any, you know, Elden Ring. I never got around to those games, just didn't have enough time, but yeah, you know, it makes complete sense to me.
Through browsing online forums, that there's a growing disdain for competitive elements in video games, particularly matchmaking algorithms. Maybe one day in the future, games might find a happy balance between casual and competitive all on their own. But until then, it's probably best to keep your head on a swivel.
Funny.
Thank you so much for watching. This is my first attempt at a larger project video. I might have missed something.
Great video, really well done video. And this video's already got like 500,000 people that have viewed it, and this guy's only got like 10K subscribers. So this was a really well done video and incredibly engaging. Hats off to him. If you guys haven't seen him, his name is Northstar UK. Check out his channel. This is the first video I've ever seen of him. Definitely give him a subscribe. He's fucking killed it with this one video essay. Awesome. I love video analysis content. It's some of my favorite shit.